Welcome everybody, I'm John Wally, and today we're going to be talking about Boolean logic, how it impacts policies and how it can be used to give you better insights and better triggers for any of the events that are coming up within the tool. So let's start with some of the basics. On the back end of what we see in Boolean logic, where that really came from was this branch of mathematics that helped us operate with binary variables. And we think about this binary all the time when we talk about computers, these ones and zeros. And what they represent is this condition of either being true or false, and they're commonly represented by a 1 or a 0. So this was developed really in the mid-19th century, and it was the foundation for what our modern computer is today. So it makes sense that we use this around the policies and how we run the system and conditions that we're looking to either be true or false. Now there's three primary operators or operations that are done under Boolean logic. That's and, or, and not. Now there's more than that. There's several more. We're not going to be covering them in this video because the tool doesn't really use those. If you're interested, you can go out there and research on it. But for the tool, for what Tenable OT does, it uses these operators and, or, and not. So in this scenario, and always has to meet the conditions of everything that it says. So if I said, 1 equals 1 and 2 equals 2, both of those conditions are true, so therefore an and statement would be true. Where if I said or, that means only one condition has to be true. Now one has to be true for that to register as true, but you could have one true statement and 4 false statements, and as long as there's an or operator between each one of those statements, the condition would still be true. And then the final one is this not statement, where it changes true or false or vice versa. So an example of this, if we said 1 is not equal to 2, that would be a true statement. And that can be a little bit confusing, especially when we start nesting these together. And we're going to talk about that throughout this episode. So for Tenable OT policies, this system for making decisions and running calculations really drives what an event hits on. So events only trigger when there is a true statement. If it's a false statement, they do not trigger, and that's something to be aware of. That's very, very important. And I'm going to say it again just to make sure that everybody hears it, is that events only trigger on true statements. So all conditions have to be true, or at least the condition that you have in the formula in front of you. All right. So let's move into equals and not equals. And this is this not statement we were talking about. So either something equals something or it does not equal something. And so we'll walk through a few of these as examples. So number one that we have an example here is 1 equals 1. And so we see that as a true statement. Everybody knows that 1 equals 1. So if we were doing this and we ask it in programming and we said the condition has to be true, 1 equals 1 would be true. Now in the next example though, 1 equals 2 we know is a false statement. And so the system will return back a false or a 0. And we'll see these as well for not equals. And you'll see this in the same way when we say something's not in a group, something's not in monitored assets, or something's not in my approved engineering workstation. So you'll see these not statements that are there. And so in this scenario, we're saying 1 is not equal to 2. And in this case, 1 is not equal to 2, and that's a true statement. And then the next one is 1 is not equal to 1. And we know that's not true because 1 is equal to 1. So I know that's a lot of words, but we're going to dig into these a little bit. You should be kind of tracking along, even though we have a lot of these equal and not equal back and forth in these statements. But I find going through and looking at examples of this really helps it all come together for us. All right, so let's talk about the AND operator. We said there were 3 operators that we're going to be discussing. This is the first one, and there's something significantly different from and than our other operators, and that is that all the statements in an and condition have to be true. It doesn't matter if 2 are right and 1 is wrong. They all have to be correct in order for a true outcome. And so if we look at our first example here and we say 1 equals 1 and 2 equals 2, is this a true or false condition? And so if we look at the first part of that, we know that 1 does equal 1, so that's true. And we know the second part of that is 2 equals 2, and we know that's true. So both true and true would equal true in this scenario. And our second statement, we have 1 equals 1, which we know is true. We say, and 2 equals 1, which we know is false. So even though we have a true statement here, because one of our statements are false, that makes the whole statement false. So this next one will be false. Now we can also use not operators. And so we're going to say 1 is not equal to 2, and we know that that's a true statement. And 2 is not equal to 3. And so we know that's a true statement. So in this situation, we're going to end up with the overall condition of being true. Our next one, we have 1 is not equal to 1 and 2 is not equal to 2. In this scenario, we know both statements are false because 1 is equal to 1 and 2 is equal to 2. Then finally, we have 1's not equal to 1 and 2 is equal to 2. In this scenario, we see that 1's not equal to 1 is a false statement because it is equal to 1. And then our second statement, 2 equals 2, is a true statement. So we have a false and a true statement, making the overall condition false. All right, so remember with ands, everything in the statement has to be true for it to be true. And the reason we call this out is in our logic, when we're talking about Tenable OT, and is one of the basic areas that's used for all of our policies. And there's an implied and between each condition whenever we're going to edit a policy. So if we bring up our policy here, I'm going to bring this up in our Tenable OT instance that we've been running, and I already have it up in an edit mode. So what you'll see over here is I have source as a condition, I have destination as a condition, I have protocol as a condition, and I have schedule. So each one of these have an implied and in between them. So if I were to read this the same way we did our previous statement, I would say the source is in any asset and is in any of these controllers and is not in this set of protocols and is in any time that's scheduled. So there's an implied and between each one of these. Now this can get really complicated. In this scenario, we only have 4 conditions that we have to meet. But we can also add additional conditions in there and it ends up nesting these even further, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes. All right, so that's and it's important to understand that each one of our conditions within Tenable OT when we're editing policies are based on the and statement. All right, so this takes us to or, and we're not going to use or very often, but there are some places where we'll want to. Usually if you're getting a situation where you're using or in conditional statements, it typically means you need to create a duplicate policy and then you want to set it up to learn something different. But it's still important to understand the or statement. Or statements are true as long as one statement is true. It doesn't matter if 10 of them are wrong. If one's right, the whole condition is seen to be right or true. So let's walk through a few of these. So if we have 1 equals 1 or 2 equals 2, this would be a true statement. Now, when we look at these, we can have all the conditions being true or only a single condition being true. Doesn't matter, as long as one condition is true, the whole condition is true or the whole statement is true in and of itself. All right, so in our next example, we have 1 equals 1, which we know is true, or 2 equals 1. And unlike and, this is still a true statement because one of the conditions, 1 equals 1, is a true statement. We can look at the not operator as well in these, where we're saying 1's not equal to 2, which is a true statement, or 2 is not equal to 3, which is also a true statement. So both of these are true, but only one would have to be true. So this is also a true statement. Now the next condition we have is 1 is not equal to 1, which is a false statement, and 2 is not equal to 2, which is also a false statement. So in this scenario, because we don't have any conditions that are true, the overall statement is false. And then finally, we have 1's not equal to 1, which is false, or 2's equal to 2, which is true. Because 2 equal 2 is a true statement, it makes the overall condition true. All right, so let's get into how these work together. And if we talk about nesting, this is really how Tenable OT works. So I'm going to break this down in kind of a step-by-step process because these can get complicated. So if we look at this condition of 1 equals 1 or 1 equals 2 and 1 equals 1 and 2 equals 2, how do we figure out what the overall statement is? And the reason this is important is our policies fire this way. The only difference is we start with 4 and statements. We start with our source and our destination and our schedule and our protocol. So we have these 4 and statements within the tool, but we're just going to work with one right now where we have nesting. So instead of us saying something like we have any asset as a source, what if we said we had any asset as a source and we had approved engineering workstations as a source? So then you would have this statement where we would have, like we see the second half of this, one condition and another condition nested that's already in this overall and condition or operator. So let's do a little bit of work through this one. So our very first one, we're going to say 1 is equal to 1, which is true. And then we're going to say 1 is equal to 2, which is false. So we have true or false would equal true. So that's our first part of this. So we're going to go through and we're going to say true is our first statement, false is our second statement. Because we have our or operator in the middle, that means the overall statement is true. So we have true and now we got to solve the second part, which is 1 equals 1 is true and 2 equals 2 is true, meaning that the overall statement is true. Now, if we were to look at this simplified, we would say true and true. And this means that both conditions are true, which is needed by the AND operator. So then if we go to the next one, we'll see the overall is true for this statement. So let's tie this directly into what this would look like in our environment. So if you see that our source is in any asset and our destination is in any asset and our schedule is in any schedule and our protocol is in any protocol, it would mean that our policy would create an event on every packet it saw. And this is important, that this source and destination and schedule and protocol. So for each one of these, for you to be able to create, remember, and statements, is every statement has to be true in order to create a policy. But because we said in any on every one of these, everything would be there because we said any protocol at any time, at any destination, and any source would create an event. Well, we don't want that in the real world. So that's why we use these not controls that are in there. So if you look at this, we have this not in any, not in any, not in any, and not in any. So this is the opposite of what we saw it would be impossible for any of these statements to be true because we have and conditions between them. So we would never create an event based on a policy created this way. And then finally, if we look at what this really looks like, if we said our source was in monitored assets and it was talking to any destination on any schedule and any protocol, this policy would create an event on every packet as long as it was originated inside monitored networks. So you can see, while this may be a problem when we start talking about communication to external networks as an example. Because in this scenario, because anything that originates here, even if it's talking internally, so that's why our original one, when we did in our previous episodes, we talked about where a problem in the rule set that comes out of Tenable OT is because we say that our source is in monitored assets, but our destination is in anything. And this should really, if we only wanted to trigger on things that were outside of our monitored networks, we would say that our destination was not in monitored assets, and then it would only trigger on anything talking from inside to talking to outside. So we'd be changing our destination to not in monitored assets. And this is where we use this equals to or not equals to. Basically, we're saying it's not equal to our monitored assets or it is equal to our monitored network. So this policy, like we said, would create it on every packet as long as that packet's source or it's originated within that monitored asset network. So here, if we were to say the source is not in our monitored network and our destination is any, this policy would create an event on every packet as long as it did not originate within the monitored network, which is great. And we'll see this from external networks. So communication from external is written this way. But there's also a problem on this side if we start looking at the logic. So on the logic side of this, what ends up happening is because the destination may also not be in monitored networks, we may be tracking events that we don't care about because it's not touching anything in our monitored assets. So we would also want to change this policy if we wanted to only see what was talking from outside in. We would have to define our destination as being in our monitored asset network. Because the way it's set up now is anything that's generated that's not in our monitored assets is going to trigger. All right, so now let's put this together a little bit. So if we said our source is in monitored networks and not in engineering workstations, then we want to trigger. So this policy would create an event as long as the source was in the monitored networks, and we saw that, and not in the engineering workstations. So let's talk a little bit about how this looks. So if it's in monitored networks, let's say it's true. And let's say it's not in engineering workstations, and that's true. So if both are true with this and statement in the source, then the whole overall event's going to be true. So this is even where we get further into nesting, because now if you were to read this out the whole way, we'd say if the source is monitored networks and in engineering workstations and the destination is any and the schedule is any and the protocol is any, then create an event. So you can see how long these will get. Now, if one of these conditions are false, because we have an and statement here, then it will not trigger. So for example, if it's in monitored network, but it's not in the engineering workstations, it would work. But what if it was in engineering workstations? So if we said if it's in a monitored network and it's in the workstations, guess what? It creates no event. Also, if we say It's not in the monitor network, but it is in these workstations. It also will not create an event because the engineering workstations have been approved. And the question may be, well, wouldn't we want to know if an engineering workstation was outside? Absolutely, but we have other rules to figure that out. And we'll capture that from external networks. So a different policy will catch those. So almost always, when you're doing nesting within your source, your destination, your policy, you're going to be using the AND statement. So if we go over here, and you'll see this, I'm saying in any asset. Let's say I were to change this to my monitored assets, and I'm going to say it's not in, just to kind of see this here. And the next thing I'm going to say, and it's in our engineering workstations, is how this would look in our actual policy. We would want both conditions to be true in order this to fire. If it was just in engineering workstations, it wouldn't fire. Or if it was outside of our monitored assets, it would not fire in this scenario. So you can see this looks exactly the way that we would see it on the other side. Now we could say, if we wanted to, so it looks exactly the same way, we could say any asset, any protocol, and we could say any schedule. And this is exactly what we saw on our slide. So whenever you're putting these together, you want our source now has an AND statement in here. Now, all right. So in the last little area that we're talking about in the ORs, and you're going to see a lot of red on the screen because we don't recommend, or I don't recommend, that you use the OR operator when you're nesting your different policies and editing those as we go through. Now let me show you this in the tool real quick. If we bring this up, what I could do in here, instead of saying and, I'm going to delete this one and I'm going to create an OR, and I'm going to say not in, and we're going to say engineering workstations, so that it looks like the way that we have it set up in here. And I'm going to talk about the problem with this. So if we say that we want a statement of true, remember true is what fires an event. So what we're trying to say here, and the reason we don't like ORs, we're saying if an asset's not in monitored assets, trigger. Because all the conditions the rest of the conditions are any. So we could say if it's not in monitored assets, trigger. No matter what it's doing, trigger. Or anything that's not an engineering workstation, trigger. So in both scenarios, we're not really writing an event or a policy that's going to give us a lot of value. Because what we're saying is we want to know if something that's not an engineering workstation is talking in this event. But the problem is if we say or, right? Because we said if it's not in assets, it doesn't have to be an engineering workstation anymore. So we've just broken the policy because we're saying if it's anything that's not a monitored asset, or if it's not an engineering, so now it's kind of broken it. And it's going to trigger on a lot of things. So it's going to trigger on every single thing out there that is not an engineering workstation. So you'll see this. This is saying where it's in our monitored network, but not in our engineering workstations. All the others, so all of these conditions are true. So now we're saying if this is true, or if this is true, both do not have to be true. That means that anything that's not an engineering workstation will trigger the event, period, regardless of what network it's in. So in this case, if you wanted to see engineering workstations that were outside of the network, I would create one condition and one rule for that. And I would create a different condition or rule where it says where I wanted to know when it was inside, and I would use the OR operator, the AND operator instead of the OR operator. So hopefully this has been helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to post in the comments. I watch those closely. Hit that like button, subscribe, and you'll get notified as each one of these put it out there if you highlight the little bell. Thank you for all your time and for watching the video, and I hope you have a great day.